Cosatu Secretary General Njali is in hot water. According to a African News 24 report, Njali allegedly colluded with business to oust former President Jacob Zuma. Sources apparently overheard him allegedly admitting to Cosatu having been used by big business to remove former President Jacob Zuma from office. Njali allegedly made these comments at the ANC's manifesto workshop on Monday. He was apparently frustrated by retrenchments in the mining industry and feeling betrayed, and revealed that the sector had approached them to root out corruption and Zuma. But all they're getting back from them is job cuts. Now, effort to get comment earlier on from Cosatu were unsuccessful, but we are about to get a comment now, as joining us in the studio is the Director of Free Market Foundation, Mr. Leon Lowe, and on the phone line is South African Trade Union's acting spokesperson, Patrick Craven, and Cosatu's General Secretary, Njali. A very good evening to you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, let me start with you, Mr. Njali, just to give you a right of reply. Are these statements, accusations against you true? And just give us, your perspective.
I think firstly we issue a statement this afternoon clarifying our positions that in 2016 November, one of our biggest affiliate tabled a motion in the Cosatu CC that they've come to the conclusion that the President Zuma has failed to lead South Africa and therefore he must resign. We then agreed in that CC in November 2016 that as Cosatu we needed to allow all unions to have a debate to take a position on this matter, which would then allow about 5 months from November to March for unions to debate this matter. When the president reshuffled without talking to the federation, we convened a special CEC, and the matter was discussed, and the Cosatu took a resolution that President Zuma should step down. We communicated the matter to the ANC. We met President Zuma, me and the president, on his request. We didn't change the position of the CEC. So we met later, I think in June, we met business and discussing in an open meeting on the issues of their decision to not to invest, which we're saying to them their investment strikes. In that discussion, we then jointly with business issue a statement which is in the public domain, what was discussed in that particular meeting. So it can't be correct, as people now try to claim that Cosatu was approached to take a decision in June, when Cosatu in March took a decision about President Zuma. It does not make any sense to anybody who's a serious journalist and who's knowing the fact and the lineage of how things have been developing in terms of chronological development. So it's not true. It's just a pure lie to us. Are those people who are still in Nazareth in terms of the ANC politics. So it is not true, to give the effect to these things. If people who are then saying Cosatu play a role to remove President Zuma and they give us that accolade, we'll accept that we make that contribution, but on our own mandate, on our own members in May 2017, on the 1st of May, before we meet businesses, refused President Zuma to address them in Bloemfontein. Are then people suggesting that those members were bribed, that when they make the motion in 2016 were bribed, that the CC delegate in a special CC in March were bribed? It doesn't just make sense.
Well, I'm going to ask you to stay on the phone line with us as we come to our other guests, and thank you for that clarification. Just coming to you, Mr. Lowe, do you think that business and politics should be mixing?
Well, I think they should preferably not. I think politics should get out of the way, but let's just understand something very clearly. Virtually every government policy in the last 10 years has been extremely anti-business. Mining rights worth billions have been expropriated without compensation. There's new laws called Twin Peaks, for example, which make it very difficult, certainly for small and independent and emerging black businesses, essentially impossible to enter into the financial services sector. Insurance of health has been banned, and now medical aids are likely to be banned under the new NHI policy. So there's a relentless attack on business by government. If business had any influence at all, none of this would be happening. The only businesses that seem to have any positive influence on government are state-owned enterprises, and they are businesses. They seem to be able to get an endless amount of bailouts at the expense of the poor, money which is transferred from housing and healthcare and education and service delivery into failing state enterprises, actually old apartheid dinosaurs. And then, of course, the president's own type of business called BEE business, probably somewhat insulting because it implies that people who are black who succeed were beneficiaries of some sort of government assistance. That's not necessarily true, obviously. But if business had any influence, then virtually none of the policies and laws that have been adopted in the last decade would have been adopted. So clearly the fact that many businesses, and let's understand business is everything from a spaza shop and a street vendor to a big multinational, they're all business. And you and I are now having discussion over a business transmission. This is business. And so business clearly would have, many businesses, including some, organized black South African business, for example, wanted President Zuma to step down. And that seems to have been, as far as I can tell, to do with politics. It seems to be to do with the belief that he was not good for the governing ANC. And the fact that many workers, many unions, many business organizations agreed on that, and many journalists, does not mean one of them had any particular influence. Then there were many who didn't agree with that at all. So business is divided. Business isn't one single entity, just as we now know, because we have two rival unions. Labour is not one entity. Labour has different opinions within different unions, different individuals. Business is like that. Some businesses want the government to help them with protectionism, called beneficiation, to protect them against their own inefficiency and incompetence, and subsidize them. And sometimes they succeed. But mostly businesses, whether it's street vendors wanting the right to trade on the streets of Johannesburg, or whether it's multinationals wanting to start mining companies, government is their enemy and government is hostile and government doesn't listen to them.
Now, Mr. Craven, can I get your voice on this topic? Do you think that business and politics should be mixing?
It's absolutely impossible to separate business from politics. And I totally disagree with everything that Leon Lowe has just said. Business has become more politically powerful than ever before, and has enormous influence on government policy, going right back to the settlement which was reached in the early 1990s, particularly through GEAR, and then the National Development Plan, which consolidated the dominance of big business over the whole country, including unfortunately, the ANC, which bought into the agenda, which was based mainly on the views of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And SAFTU has been consistently opposed to these policies. And also, I would totally disagree that business includes a wide spectrum. The spaza shop owners, the street traders, are the victims of monopoly capital. They're not part of the ruling class. We are one of the most monopolized economies in the world, in which power and wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very, very small, very, very rich elite. And unfortunately, they have persuaded the ANC and its government, and in particular the current president, that this is the way forward. We have to satisfy the demands of the credit rating agencies. And unfortunately as well, Cosatu went along with these policies for too long and were not prepared to break with an ANC leadership which was clearly no longer in the interests of the workers. It's true that there is agreement now that the form of business that Jacob Zuma represented, an openly corrupt and criminal form of capitalist rule, had to be abolished. But SAFTU, or its affiliates, who've now become its affiliates, were the very first to raise this question of Zuma. As early as 2013, the NUMSA Special National Conference passed a resolution saying that Zuma must resign. And that has been the position adopted by SAFTU itself. And many years later, in fact 4 years later, because Becky's just said it was 2017, Cosatu finally saw the light. And we welcome this, that Zuma had to go. But what we would say to both Leon Lowe and to Becky is that it's entirely wrong to see corruption and criminality as solely the prerogative of government or state-owned enterprises. And this is where I think Leon Lowe is so completely wrong. The business world is riddled with exactly the same kind of criminality which we see in the state-owned enterprise. The difference is it's much better hidden. It's disguised with a lot of propaganda, of which Leon Lowe is one of the chief perpetrators, trying to pretend that somehow big business operates in the interests of the whole of society, and in particular small business, whereas in fact it's the biggest enemy of small business, which keeps them out of shopping malls, which makes it very difficult to get their products onto the shelves of political parties.
Well, let me just give them a right of reply. Let me start with you, Mr. Nchali. If you can respond to Patrick Craven on the influence that perhaps politics might have on business or that businesses might have on politics.
Look, I agree that you can't separate business and politics. In fact, the ideology of this business to exploit people in itself is a political stance that business has taken on workers in dealing with those issues. Regrettably, is that the existence of trade unions as an ideology is dependent on the existence of a capitalist class, because trade union by its nature is trying to get a fair share of the capitalist system. So the two are symbiotic in terms of they live together, they have different interests in dealing with those things. And equally it's true that if you look to the world over, the influence of big business in politics is an example that is happening. If you look to America, is led by a president who's a big business. So it's true that business have an interest in politics, and they're playing a big politics in this thing. Even here at home, I want to agree that if you were looking to the question of privatization, it was led by business. If you look to the tax incentive, the nature of our taxation, the question of the sunset clause and NDP, you can see in the mirror of the influence in business. So that there's no debate about that businesses is dealing with those issues. They try everything to influence the question of business in dealing with those issues. But have said that one, we were happy that Craven will accept that he has been part of Cosatu for a very long time. When he referred to the issue that Cosatu have been doing for the very long time, it includes himself and the leaders of the unions that now they're talking about. So we must not forget about those issues. Strange enough, though, that we need to say and put it on record, that when businesses call for Zuma and they march, their general secretary was part of those people in joining businesses. So he should not play the role that, no, SAFTU is not talking to business in dealing with those issues. They were part of the march. When we refused, we said the call for Zuma and the corruption and everything must happening. But Cosatu will not march, which is a class enemy in dealing with those particular issues. So they chose it. That's their decision, and we can't blame them for taking for that particular decision. When we march, I think there's a second mistake that he's making. When we march on the 27th of March about the question of corruption and state power and all those things, we made quite clear that it's not only government where corruption is. Corruption is everywhere. In our march, we marched to the big businesses, we marched to the Chamber of Mines, we marched to government, because in all these sectors that we're talking about, that corruption is corruption everywhere. In fact, there would be no corruption in government if there was no collaborator from the private sector. So in that, we agree with him. There's no debate about the influence of big business. Any trade unions will stand up and agree that big businesses have a huge influence in many governments in the world. That's why we have to change the system in total so that we can be able to talk about a different system. So there's no differences between us and SAFTU in terms of the influence of big businesses. Anybody, law knows this exactly, that they had an influence in the labor brokering, they had influence in the e-tolling, so they must not play a clean guys in dealing with these issues.
Well, in the interest of time, let me just give Mr. Lowe a chance to respond to what has been said.
Well, it's very simple. The mining industry is supposedly big business. Please note that we've shifted from talking about business to big business, whatever that means. That remains undefined. The mining industry had billions and billions and billions of rands of its capital, mining rights, removed without compensation. Right now, we have an insurance industry, which I presume they consider big business, and the insurance industry has been banned, forbidden, from insuring your health. So ordinary South Africans may not buy health insurance. It's prohibited. At the moment, they're entitled to buy medical aid. That is about to be banned. It has now been announced. So the biggest businesses, the mining and insurance companies, have been unable to stop the government's relentless attack on business. And then another one is the banks. We are now going to get this financial services regulation, which is a vicious assault on not just the providers of financial services, but the recipients of financial services. Now, of course, business interferes with government, or tries to, and the reason is very simple and obvious, is when government is engaged in a permanent and relentless attack on business, which Patrick Craven says he happens to have some mysterious and secret information about corruption that the prosecuting authorities don't have. Well, why doesn't he give it to them? Then what we find is, what must business do? If business interferes with what you do, which is broadcasting and journalism, well, of course you're going to react by trying to influence the government to not interfere and not make it difficult for you to operate as a journalist and a communicator. So, yes, if the government were to leave business alone, for example, despite what they say, small business is business, big business is business, street traders in Johannesburg, we were the ones, the Free Market Foundation, who took the Johannesburg City Council to the Constitutional Court to remove the prohibition of street traders in Johannesburg. Where were the unions? Where were the people who say they care about the poor? Nowhere to be seen. It had to be people who believe in business, who believe in small and informal business, who came to their aid, and they are business, and they are important business, and they're a big sector of South African business. The entire stock exchange, all of the stock exchange put together, is the equivalent of what the government spends in just over 2 years. In other words, it's not really that big at all compared to the government. By far the biggest amount of business is medium, small, and micro enterprises, and people like peasant farmers, commercial farmers, and so on. But the fact is, the government launches a war on business in other countries, African countries, for example. Business is now the darling of government. So the governments in these countries are doing the opposite of what we are doing. Instead of perpetuating and propping up failed state-owned enterprises, they are busy privatizing them. Instead of smothering the economy in regulation, they are deregulating. So if we want to learn from the rest of Africa, then we would actually change our policy to be pro instead of anti-business.
Well, just to get to closing comments from you, Mr. Craven, in 1 minute.
First of all, the criminality within the private sector. I just need to mention a few names: Steinhoff, KPMG, SAP, McKinsey. All of them have been implicated in their criminal activities around the whole Gupta question. And we do not believe these are just isolated examples. They are what big business is about. And as for the mining industry, we've just seen recently that an attempt to try to have what we regard as minimal advances towards the transformation of the mining industry have been met with hostility. These are not attempts by government to dictate to the mining industry. They're just pleading for some modest advancements of black people within the industry. And we believe they haven't gone far enough. They should take over the whole mining industry, which has completely failed to deliver any form of transformation. It is now retrenching thousands of workers, closing down their mines, and clearly is no longer playing any progressive role in society at all.
I do have to interject just because of time, Mr. Craven. Mr. Nchali, just 30 seconds for you.
Two issues just as one to conclude with, unfortunately, that Mr. Lowe must accept that business in South Africa, and the majority of them are benefited from the apartheid. It's a fact. Secondly, that if you look to taking Craven further, point further, you just need to go to the Competition Commission and look in terms of the collusion and the corruption that has happened within the private sector, led by big businesses, and many of them who have pleaded guilty that they are part of the corruption and they've acted in that manner. So there's no debate about business being involved in corruption.
Well, thank you very much to you, Mr. Nchali, to you, Mr. Patrick Craven, as well as you, Mr. Lowe. It is time now for a short break, but stay tuned for your business news coming up next.